There's a little-known part of Hollywood that most people are not aware of, known as the audience test preview. The recently released book, Audienceology, reveals this for the first time. Our podcast series, Don't Kill the Messenger, brings this book to life, taking a peek behind the curtain. And now, join author and entertainment research expert, Kevin Getz.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight and waiting so patiently. The film you're about to see is a work in progress, which means the women and the men who are working on it are doing some final touches. You'll notice that color and sound are not balanced. Music is temporary. Some visual effects are still being worked on. If you do notice any of these technical imperfections, just know that when the movie is released, all of these things will be technically perfect. That is what I say to a recruited audience when we screen a movie, and my next guest has probably heard that speech more times. I already heard him laughing in the background here and can probably imitate it better than most. I'm here with David Rosenbloom, who has an impressive list of almost 24 feature film credits as an editor. He's one of our best editors. He's directed, he's produced as well. He's been nominated for the Academy Award for the movie The Insider, and in recent years has worked on some of our favorites, All Good Things, The Black Mass, The Way Back. I'm so excited to have you here. I've always enjoyed you, and we've always been buddies from the very first time we met. David Rosenbloom. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Kevin. That was that sounded no different than the first time I heard it 25 or 30 years ago. I mean, literally.
Well, no, hold on. Actually, Joe Farrell, who started it, would say, if you remember this, and I bet you do, it was something like, after the movie, you can all stay in your seats as you are now. I say, I'll be back here after the show. And Joe used to say, I'll be back here looking for all of you there. And people would turn and go, what did he just say? What does that mean? And I finally was saying it because that's what he trained me to do. And I finally, at one point, maybe 25 years ago, I finally said, what the F am I saying? It doesn't make any sense. And I changed it. So anyway, we have so much to talk about. So when you hear that, and I have to say, I think it's fair to say that you and I, meaning the editor and the person who is running that test screening, have probably the closest relationship and so much information that we're going to be sharing and you're going to be using as you leave that evening.
Yes. I mean, it's critical. That relationship is really important. And, you know, I've heard it on this podcast before that there can be quite a difference between people who run these focus groups at the end. And that can really lead us down some very, very dark places, not just the night of the focus group, but in the days that follow, because sometimes it can go off the rails and it takes an experienced focus group leader like yourself to make it run smooth. And I'll just get this out of the way. Everybody says it. You are the best. Everybody says it because it's true.
Oh, thank you.
And you drive a car like a Maserati and it's fun to drive. And then every so often we fall into like a Yugo or a Fiat and it just doesn't run the same way. And some of these focus groups go that way. And we're sitting back there powerless. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to stand up during a focus group and either applaud because that was perfect. Sometimes I do give you a thumbs up and you get a lot of thumbs up from people behind us, but we can't say anything because we don't want the focus group to know that there's really anybody of import.
Let me just say, so everyone fills out a questionnaire after a screening, right? For those of you who don't know, many of the listeners do know, however, but we do a focus group of 20 pre-selected members of the audience, kind of a microcosm of the demography that was recruited for that audience. So if you have 10 females and 10 males, let's say, and you might have 4 people who are in the 18 to 20 category, and then 21 to 24, you might have 4 more, and then 25 to 39, and then 40 to 49, whatever, 4 and 4. So you balance the audience, and so you have to pick that right group, and you're really in the hands of the people who are selected. But you're absolutely right. This is information that is coming to the forefront that if it's not harvested correctly and then it's not communicated back correctly, could be really, I imagine, quite damaging.
Well, it can be. I mean, it just, what happens is it creates extra work. in the days and weeks that follow, because if everything goes perfect,
when does that happen?
even when everything goes perfect, there's still an interpretation of the data. There's still, everybody can spin these numbers to suit their own agenda. That's one of the very few pitfalls of previewing. We all love previewing. It's the most exciting, most terrifying night of
that first screening. Is that
it
first
it really
night,
is. You have no idea.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. Give me an idea of what it feels like when I make that announcement. What is going through your brain, your heart, your body? You've just now spent months in a dark room with maybe a couple of assistants. One might even be your son, Joe, who has been working with you for the last 8 or so years. What are you thinking?
Well, in the days gone by, back in the old days when we were still double system, all you were hoping for was that it stayed in sync. It didn't break, because we're up with separate platters of picture and sound. That was always the unnerving thing, was we just want it to go technically fine. Since now that it's all digital, there's really nothing that can go wrong technically. I mean, there's a glitch every once in a while, but nothing that that would cause the preview to come to a halt. So now you just hope that the audience is seeing the movie the way I have expected them to see it as I'm working on it, because as editors, we pretty much were the first audience. And so we want them to experience it the way that we experience it when we first watch it.
How often do you feel your first cut is something that is really the director almost exclusively versus your interpretation of it, or what you may disagree but can't express yet because you need the audience to say it, or you need some other validation? What percentage do you feel confident on that first cut going out with?
It's really director dependent, because some directors are very collaborative. So whatever we walk out of the room with, it's something that we've both arrived at together when we go to that preview, because, I mean, we butt heads along the way and we come to see the other person's point of view, in many of the cases. But when we're ready for the preview, that's the movie that we have both been working on for the last many months. And so we go out there. We're never really, with certain directors, it's not a different movie than I would prefer to put up there. It's always the movie that
Is it?
Yeah, it is. I've worked with some directors multiple times. And so when you're in that situation, you've come to speak the same language, and they know my taste, I know their taste. So,
right.
But when I'm working with a new director, and some directors who don't necessarily trust the editor's input, or it's not that they don't trust the editor's input, but they don't believe that an editor really can see inside their head, so they must tell them how to do it.
I've so enjoyed working with you, and I know you've come in as a fixer often on movies. They brought you in to get your opinion and your feelings when something's not really working, and they'll say, what do you think? I have tremendous respect for the editor, maybe more than any single person on a movie, because I've had an up-close and personal view of just what an editor can do to make or break a film. I am a very big supporter of an editor, because the editor is the first person to be fired or blamed. And I often find that so not fair. So I'll often be the proponent, and I'll say, whoa. Do me a favor, and before you fire your editor, let the director take a few weeks off and just have the editor go and do what they think. Now, I mean, I know I'm being a good guy by doing it, right? I feel like I am. And I feel like it's probably the right thing. However, you form this bond, this relationship with the director. I'm wondering, is it something that would be legitimately executed? Or are you just going to be so loyal to the director's vision that you wouldn't have the nerve, if you will, to make your own cut?
Well, again, it's...
You get where I'm going with this?
I do. Again, it's director dependent. Some would embrace that and say, absolutely, I'll go hang out on a beach for 3 weeks. I'll come back. And
Who would do that?
Which director?
Yeah, is there a name that you can that is really open and
Oh, most of them.
Wow.
Yeah, most of them would really dig it.
It's really good to hear, actually.
Yeah, no, because we've formed that bond. And the deciding factor, of course, is the schedule. So if there's no ramifications of the schedule, then sure, 3 weeks, absolutely. Because we've already arrived at a point. If we're in a position where the movie isn't really working.
Have you ever done that where you actually did?
No, I can do something in 3 days if they're away that would be as meaningful as 3 weeks.
How many times have you done that, shown it to the director and said, I like your version better?
I'll be honest with you. The egos are sort of checked at the door for the most part. And I can tell you a lot of changes that have been made in movies that I've worked on, but I can't tell you who was responsible for the note.
Well,
because it becomes just about the movie.
Okay, so then we're sitting in a focus group and a respondent says, well, the cutting was really jerky, or the cutting was really fast and slow, pace was really off. What do you think when someone says that? What personally is going through your...
I take it very personally.
But why, if you're saying it's so collaborative?
Because it's my job. And we're not sitting there like making cuts, he's using his left hand and I'm using my right hand sort of thing. It's not that kind of thing.
Well, it is for the director's cut, isn't it? Kind of like that?
Yes and no. Not really.
Okay.
There's so many conversations that take place during production, pre-production. We'll talk about the script with some directors. Mm-hmm. There's a lot that goes into it, in establishing the relationship and the rapport with the director. Conversations that take place during shooting. Notes that come in from viewing of the dailies, so that by the time he's looking at he or she, I've worked with many directors who, when we look at the first cut, it's very much what they hope to see. Mm-hmm, not because the work is, I'm not saying that the work is perfect or finished, but it's not out of left field. It's what they expect to see. And then we approach it together. So no, it's not really a left-hand, right-hand thing. It's just more of a conversation that takes place. And again, director dependent upon whether I will work for a few hours and they'll come in and see it, or I'll finish a part of a scene and they'll be right behind me. Gavin O'Connor is a great example of...
what a terrific talent he is.
He's amazing. He's great.
That guy is talented. I was out to dinner with my husband, and I think his wife or someone was there, and I said, Gavin, I just want to tell you what a fan I am of your work. He's really a terrific writer and a director.
Yeah.
Is his brother one also?
Brother. He worked with his brother. Once upon a time, and it had been a while since I'd worked with a new director, one that I hadn't worked with, because I tend to work with the same guys over and over. We had a lot of conversations during production, but once we started working, and he saw the editor's cut, and he, responded like many, like, okay, let's roll up our sleeves. We got a lot of work to do. And that's not a comment on the cut. It's just a comment on, we're seeing...
You don't take that personally when they say that?
No, I did when I was starting out, because, but once I figured out, look, if they're giving me an editor's cut, which they do, we get a couple of weeks, including what we're doing during production.
What's an editor's cut compared to a director's cut?
Well, it's the first cut of the movie.
Oh, an assembly, we call it.
It's grown to, that word has kind of insinuated itself into the vernacular, but it's not really an assembly. It's a cut. They're looking at the cut of the movie.
Absolutely. And so I want to re-educate myself.
Okay.
It's much more respectful to say an editor's cut, because they're doing work on it. They're not just cutting scenes together willy-nilly. They're
right. Yeah, and it's not really, none of us, you wouldn't talk to an editor and said, I'm going to show the assembly tomorrow, but because it always used to be called either the editor's cut or it was called the first cut. But it's just splitting hairs, really. Do we take it personally? No, somehow the word entered the vocabulary. We don't know why. We have no idea why, but it's become, this is what the studios will call it. Everybody will call it the editor's assembly. Anyway, that's what the director sees first. And
now we're going to roll our sleeves.
Now we roll up our sleeves. And I'm fine with that, because I'm not going to alter the script very much in that first cut that he sees, unless we've had a conversation during production. And this happens a lot. It happened with Mimi Leader all the time, with Greg Hoblet, which I did 5 movies with him. With Scott Cooper, I did a couple of movies with Scott. And
that says something about who you are, too, to get repeat business. Sorry. And I notice a lot of editors have that kind of relationship, because it's a very intimate relationship with your director.
It is. And it's a great relationship. So with Gavin, you have to start that relationship over. So it's like a first date in a way. You start to know what they're thinking, and then so you're going to go and you're going to hang out a little bit, you're going to have a meal together, you're going to understand. And through the course of all this, or even if I visit set, which if I go to the set, I'm the only guy who really doesn't have a question for the director. They're answering 1,000 questions an hour.
Good point.
And yet I'll come along, and back in the days when we went on location, I used to like that, because I would just be around, and if they just wanted to not think about what's happening, when there's 60 or 70 people around that are all working. And
you will say, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You will say, make sure you get this. They're about to move on, and you're like, I need this.
Yeah, no.
You never?
No.
Really?
No, because I guess I've been lucky. I haven't worked with directors who ever need to hear that.
Okay.
Because there's so many people that if they're missing that.
I've heard that story many times where, if they only got that,
Look, after
that over the shoulder, I have nothing to cut to or whatever it may be.
Yeah, if it's that obvious, if it's that somebody's going to shout it out. The script supervisor will shout it out. The DP will make note of it.
Has anyone ever gone back and reshot something because you looked at dailies and it just didn't work? It didn't cut?
That happens on occasion. I wouldn't sit on the set and say, this isn't working. The director has, they have their plan. Now that all gets revisited when they see the cut. And, if I have a suspicion of that needs to happen, then I'll cut that scene quickly and I'll have the director look at it while they're shooting and say, are you okay with this? Or do we feel like we need some more stuff?
A lot of listeners are going to ask this question, I think, or be curious about this question. David, how do you explain to someone, particularly, and the winner is at the Oscars, what we would be looking at that would constitute good editing versus good directing, or bad editing versus, I have my theory and my criteria. How would you say, wow, that was so well cut?
It's the hardest thing to judge.
That's a really honest answer, but tell me.
It really, art is hard to judge. And we're all together making a movie.
Well, then how can then this is what people are going to ask. Mm-hmm. How can edited by not be the same as the best director or the best picture? I mean, they usually are, by the way.
Well, certainly the nominations would.
But that's not always the case.
No, it's not always
Sometimes
the case.
there's fancy kind of techniques that are used.
Some people feel that more editing is better editing. The quicker the cut, the more work is being put into it. That's not necessarily the case.
Well, of course.
It's just as difficult to decide where not to cut as it is to decide where to cut. How you let a shot go on longer. Like music. Music is the same thing. You can have a lot of music. It doesn't mean it's the best music. Deciding where not to have music is as important as deciding where you do have music.
And by the way, speaking of that sidetrack here, George Tillman Jr., who was a previous guest, mentioned that working with Michael Mann for 1 hour, Michael Mann wanted to see an actor in one of George's movies and the movie hadn't come out yet. So George sent Michael the movie, and Michael's reaction was, thank you so much for letting me see the performance. By the way, your music, I just want to mention something. If the emotional sort of scene is going in this direction, maybe have your music go in the other direction. And I thought that was really interesting. And he said that was a huge learning for him and something that he incorporated into his movies since.
That's pretty good. Michael has a great sense of music and a great sense of aesthetic all around. But music really is critical. I work hand in hand with the composer a lot.
Well, do you put the music usually in the temp cut?
Yes.
Not the music supervisor?
No.
Okay, so then I'm going to say, because I've done this a million times, as you know, and what I am so struck with is the temp score. And I've made 12 movies myself, so I can also speak to this. You get used to it. There's a term they use in the
temp love.
Temp love. And it's like, in your case, you, David, will make the decision of placing this music from this other movie and this music, and then you know that the scenes are working. So then the composer, I guess, is not going to take such a departure from that style, but it's all from you.
I'm
not talking about songs.
Right,
I'm talking about score.
Right. The music supervisor, by the way,
correct,
will introduce songs to us.
And by the way, the director will often say, sure, I want that song, or sometimes it's in the script.
Yes. But with the temp score for the preview process,
yes,
and for all of the screenings, both prior and subsequent to the preview, the editor is generally picking those things out and generally laying them in. We'll have help from, because they won't let us.
But what is the influence for the final product? I know that it's huge.
Yes, it is. It's huge. And I've made the mistake, or I should say it took me a while to learn, that you can't possibly show, and I put music in the first cut that we're talking about when the director sees the movie for the first time, right? But you can't possibly put in music throughout the movie without having a discussion with the director. If you show the movie to the director the first time and it's filled with music, you may as well have cast an actor in there that they never met because it plays such a big part. So I'll have conversations with the director prior to that first cut. What kind of music? Do you even want to hear music in the first cut? Generally, they want to. And we'll have a discussion about it.
Do you usually take it as personally when someone in the focus group says, I didn't like the music? Because you're not because you're not a composer.
No.
You're not, right?
No, I do not take it personally.
But if they say something about the pace, the length, not caring about the characters, something like that, well, that could be the performance, of course. But I'm saying you'll take that more personally.
Some things I take more personally.
What's the biggest change that you have made because of audience reaction?
I think it was in Out of the Furnace when we...
That was an intense movie. Yeah. He's another super talent.
Yeah,
That's Scott Cooper.
Yeah, he's
fantastic.
He's great. I think we went to New York for that preview.
Perhaps so.
Or someplace in maybe New Jersey.
San Francisco, I know we went to. Didn't we? Yes, we did.
Yeah.
That wasn't the first one, though.
No. And so I think it was the way we ended that movie because he originally gets killed. Christian Bale dies at the end of the movie, and we found out that that wasn't really what the journey that the audience wanted to go on, to be with him all this time and to be through. And it, as you said, it's a very intense movie. So when you're on the side of this character and going through the difficulties that character is going, and you're living this with him through the course of these 2 hours, to have him die at the end, it just didn't feel right.
Was that a reshoot or a cheat?
It was a cheat of epic proportion.
It was damn good.
It was really amazing. Film is so malleable. It's amazing what you can do. And I'm sure that doctors might say the same thing about how you can heal somebody. It's amazing how you can heal
gene
people.
Expression or something that you can do.
But,
You're right.
But the critical thing is to diagnose the illness, to know what the problem is. And if you start chasing the wrong problem, whether it's with somebody in the hospital or with a movie, you could spin your wheels a lot and you could really damage that movie to the point where it's hard to get it back. So you really want to make sure, which is why the preview process is so important. One of your other guests, I had heard a podcast where he said, I can't remember who it was, but after 3 or 4 questions in the focus group, he gets up and leaves because he's gotten everything he wants to get out of it. That he gets, and many of us will say the same thing about getting.
You know why, though,
I do know why, because the good stuff is up front.
Correct.
Yeah, then you get underneath it all. But all of that will come in the report later on. And when you then give us all the information, which happens a couple of days after the preview and the focus group, you sit down with all of us filmmakers and you really explain what just happened the other night. But what we're experiencing, and I think most of us like to think that while the movie is playing, we're getting the most information, that we can feel the effect of the movie on the audience. And it's very subtle, and you have to learn this. I mean, it takes many movies to figure this out. You're hearing laughs where you would have never thought they were, both good and bad.
Okay, so what's the discussion like in the editing room when I've just mined for you that they don't like the ending or are not as satisfied as the ending as perhaps they'd like to be? How does that go down? Like, screw the audience, but all right, maybe we should try it. Like, how does that conversation happen? In other words, you and I both know that it's information, right? And screenings are. And it's not the end-all be-all. And often an audience might say something. They don't necessarily mean that thing. But yet you made that change, which I'm very glad you did. And I think it actually made a more satisfying and, if I may, better movie. But I guess the question is, what happens behind the scenes to arrive at, okay, we're going to really do that?
Well, there's certainly a certain amount of denial at the beginning.
Of course. And that's every director.
I'm sure it is.
And there's directors, quite honestly, that will flatly just refuse.
Yeah, and we know them. There's acceptance. And then
you're going through the 12 steps.
I sort of am. And then there's action. Here's why editing is the greatest job in the world. To me, I've done it my whole life. In fact, we're at the place where I started like 50 years ago or something. And
well, that was Hanna-Barbera.
Hanna-Barbera,
right?
Which is,
right
they
next
had
door,
this building
right?
and right next door. And so that's where I started. And if you had told me 50 years ago that I would be doing a podcast, 50 years later,
you would say, what's a podcast?
I would say, what's a podcast? The great thing about editing is that I love filmmaking. You love filmmaking. We all love it. There is so much pressure when you're on a set because it's very hard to do something and then say, we got to do it again. Editing, like writing, you do it, you can sit back and you could do it again. And you can do it again and again. So there's no risk in trying something.
Oh my gosh, it is manna. I mean, words that I often say, which is try it. You can always go back. Of all the movies, and I don't know, I've done like 6,000 movies. Of all those movies, I don't think I've ever seen a movie get worse because of research. Not always get better. Most of the time, there is some improvement, certainly in scores, and also just in the overall vibe of the movie. It feels tighter. It feels more expressed. The director's vision is more realized. And, sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
But you can just try it.
Sure.
And go back.
Of course. It's just a button. Once upon a time, it was a little more. You had to undo the splices.
I know, but
you had to
even
go
with
find the
that,
trims,
it
all
might
that
have
stuff.
taken longer.
Took
But
longer,
it was
but
also something you could still go back to.
Absolutely. But it was a little more labor intensive.
You remember the Moviola?
I do.
Is that how you trained? Is that how you trained?
Yeah. I was doing television in the early 80s
Wow.
and moviolas. And
So I was going to ask you about your beginning. Where are you from originally?
here, Los Angeles.
You were an LA guy.
Yeah.
And then did you go to school here
I went to UCLA,
for?
theater arts.
Were you an actor?
I was a student.
Did you want to be in the movie business? Did you?
I'd
want to
already
be...
started. I'd already started in the editing business when I was in high school.
Oh wow! So it really was in your veins.
It was. I was a senior in high school. I got offered a job, and it took me half a year, and then I'd go to school for half a year, and then I'd go back to work.
Wow.
And the cartoon business was 6 months a year.
Did you have a mentor?
I had many. Not in the animation business, I wouldn't say.
Who were the great editors in film that you were like enamored of or wanted to aspire to be?
Ann Coates.
Ann Coates. Ann V. Coates.
Ann V. Coates.
Oh, I loved her.
Artie Schmidt was just a great guy.
I know Michael Kahn was really influential with
Billy. Yeah.
Billy Goldenberg, yeah.
Yeah, and I knew Michael when I was working at Amblin, and he was across the hall, and we would talk. There's a lot of guys
What
that
a gent he was. What a
he
gentleman.
Is, he still is. He's a great guy.
I know, but
But we don't
wonderful.
really work with editors. We don't really work with other editors. I mean, occasionally I work with a team, like on The Insider with Billy Goldenberg, with Paul Rubel. I would learn so much from them just by being around because you don't really.
Yeah, they must have enjoyed the experience as much as you did.
We had a great time.
Did the three of you get credit on it?
Yes.
Does that go to arbitration, incidentally?
No, it doesn't.
What
with
is
the
it called?
Guild?
The Editors Guild?
No, it doesn't. It's not like the writing
process. It's just kind of like the right thing to do, whoever had.
It can get sticky. But Billy and Paul, who worked on the movie on Insider much longer than I did 4 or 5 months, and they were on it for a decade.
How many editorial assistants do you have?
I only have 2 at the most. I work with a very small crew.
And I never sort of understood what an editorial assistant is doing while are they cutting scenes to show you?
No.
What is Joe doing?
During production, the assistants are preparing the dailies.
In terms of files?
Creating it, breaking it down, putting it in a reasonable order so that I can access it more quickly. It's a very labor-intensive job.
What did they do in the earlier days? When there were no files.
Well, they were syncing dailies. We had the picture of the track, syncing dailies, breaking it all down.
Did they actually do the
trims.
cutting?
Oh, yeah. Every take was in its own little roll-up reel.
The stories that we could talk about, the two of us.
Oh.
When I think about Lee and so many other projectionists, it would be like we had codes on the walkie-talkies, and it'd be like, film's broke, and we all knew exactly what to do, how to go into action and get the audience wrangled and say, folks, we're going to figure out what's going on. And I always say, we're working with an unmarried print. What that means is that there's a picture track and an audio track, and they sometimes don't want to speak to each other. So we're going to find out what's going on, and we'll be back. And the poor person in the booth is just going, what do we do?
That is a cold sweat I'm glad I never have to feel anymore, but I used to all the time.
But you mentioned something. Things still go out of sync. The other thing that happens, I've noticed with digital, you'll pop the speakers more frequently at some of the theaters because they like to crank up the volume, and you'll get a section of no sound at all. Gary, you know what I'm telling you? I'm looking at our engineer in the booth here. And so that's something that will often make the movie, will stop, will recalibrated is the word I was looking for, and then continue. But going back to a couple of your movies, we talked about Primal Fear here a bunch. I remember that movie. There's so many stories about it. And I just heard Hawk Koch's interview. I don't know if you heard his podcast for the Motion Picture and Television Fund. He interviewed Ed Norton.
Oh, no, I didn't hear it.
Oh, it was really good. And that particular episode was really fascinating. Sherry told the story in my book, Sherry Lansing and Gary Lucchese, about the casting of that part. And that had to be fun as heck to work on because you really had the audience in the palm of your hands until the ending. And spoiler alert, no, I'm not going to say it.
No, don't.
I'm not going to give it.
There are
there's a whole
viewers.
new generation
Yes,
of people.
future people.
Watch Primal Fear.
Yeah, Ed was amazing, and it was a great...
And he got an Academy Award nomination.
He got an Academy Award nomination. So there was a director who I'd worked with a lot. I did 5 movies with Greg, and prior to...
He comes from television.
He does, and...
What's his big
Primal
show?
Fear,
L.A. Law? Or
a lot of them.
Hill Street Blues?
Hill Street Blues was where I met him, and I worked with him for 3 years on Hill Street Blues.
Is that why you directed an episode of Hill Street?
Yes.
Ah, because your relationship with Greg.
Because I was on the show for 3 years. They promoted everybody from within.
Talk
on that
about
show.
terrifying. Did you like directing?
Oh, I loved it. It was great. It's not the same. It's not directing television isn't the same as directing features, and directing back in the early 80s is not the same as directing now.
Was it like getting a master's degree?
No, I was too young. I was 25. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just, everybody else was raising their hands saying, hey, I want to direct. I thought, hey, I'm going to raise my hand. And boom, they let me direct it.
Wow.
It didn't go great. I don't mind saying it wasn't, wasn't.
In what way?
I truly did not know what I was doing.
Who was holding your hand, though?
Nobody.
Oh, my God.
I knew everybody. I knew all the actors. I'd been on the show for a few years, so I knew all the actors. And everybody was there to make sure that I didn't fail, because if I fail, we all fail. And it wasn't an abject failure. I'm not saying that.
It couldn't have been, because
it still went on the air.
aired.
Yeah, and it was fun. But you realize there's just I didn't study film. Everything I learned was from the perspective of editing. And so back then, when we were still on Moviolas, and there was so much more to the mechanics of, and the thought process of editing, but there was a lot of mechanics, and nobody dared say, oh, I'm a great editor, because now you're editing on computers and everybody thinks they know what editing is.
Did you find yourself, while you were directing, editing the movie?
No, not really. I know enough that if you pre-edit too much as a director, you're going to generally you'll come out with something that's a little stale. Movies, this has been said on your podcast and everywhere, there's 3 movies. There's the movie you write, and the movie you shoot, and the movie you cut. And in each of those... The
movie you write, the movie you shoot, and the movie you cut.
Yeah, and it speaks to what a living, breathing thing a movie is. There is an alchemy. You talk about alchemy in your book. There are things that you can't anticipate when you're writing, how they're going to end up when it's shot, because you now have actors coming in and breathing life into these characters. And then you go to the editing room, you're putting images together, and we're making subtle changes that nobody would ever know. We'll go back to, how do you judge editing? You can't. But you do know when you've done something that has made a difference. You're a writer. You know the difference between and but. And there is the same sort of thing in editing. You're taking a word out here. You're switching words around. That's on the micro level. On the macro level, we're moving parts of scenes. We're moving scenes to other parts of the film. So there's a lot that goes into it. So to say that as you're directing, you know exactly what's going to happen.
Or you become really a journey person, director.
Yeah.
That's just by the books. You're getting your master, you're getting your 2 shots, you're getting over the shoulder, and then you're out.
Yeah. I've done a lot of sports movies, the way back being the most recent. And I did Rudy, and I did other...
Rudy was awesome. That was an awesome movie. That really was.
That's still my favorite. Not that we can have favorites, because they're like our kids. We're not really supposed to have a favorite movie. But
no one expected it to do as well as it did.
No. Well... Yes and no. That movie tested...
TriStar?
It was TriStar. That movie tested higher than...
I remember.
It was...
Was that Dan Jr.? Dan Petrie Jr.?
No, it was David Anspaugh.
David Anspaugh, right.
Yeah.
David Donald did another one with the same actor, I believe. And it was also really, really good. Really high.
Well, this was 95. I mean, I thought it was 105, because people that were walking by outside said, hey, that sounds like a pretty good movie. But you always
go to the urinal afterwards, and you listen to the people, and they'll tell you the truth. Oh, that was really good. Yeah. Oh, I really like that. Yeah. And you do that. That's what you do in Broadway during the intermission. Yeah. All the producers, they go into the men's room or the women's room, and they listen to the comments and say, oh, we've got to change that.
Well, there wasn't much to change in Rudy.
No, I know.
It was really great, but it didn't do big business at all. It's become this perennial favorite. People watch it at the beginning of football season. They watch it at Christmas. I hear it all the time. People love that movie.
You are so fortunate to have made your living in exactly what you set out to do. You've got 3 kids. Do they kind of know what they want to do? Are they on the path to?
Well, Joe has known since he was in high school.
Who does that sound like?
I didn't know that I wanted to do it. This is
You
something
said
that
you did.
No. I didn't do anything else. So it became the thing that I did.
You mean you sort of fell into it?
I totally fell into it. Hanna-Barbera. It was my best friend. His father was the vice president, general manager of Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah, but you could have been
And he
sweeping
said,
floors, or you could have
well,
been.
no, this was the job that was
could have been-
offered. So I just,
That's what I
it
mean.
turned out that
Wow.
I had an affinity for it. But nobody in the 60s or 70s grew up saying, I want to be an editor, because nobody knew what it was. It was a dark science. Now, kids on their iPhones at 4 and 5 years old are
It's one of the
editing.
popular things in film schools, because I teach at various film schools around the country.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll do a step in for a class on market research, and I cannot tell you how many of the females and males both want to be editors. I love that.
And it's great. I love it too. And I love those classes that they take. And I love every so often I'll go in and I'll guest speak at one of these things. And the questions that they ask are great. They're looking at it in a way
Yeah.
that I wouldn't have looked at it. So Joe started, he did that. I gave him a bunch of cameras when he was a senior in high school. I said, document your senior year. Here's 4 cameras. Give them to a couple of your friends and just document your senior year.
What a great, and did they?
Yeah.
And did they come back with a finished product?
Yes and no. Some scenes were amazing. It was just
But
incredible.
never put together?
It
never-
wasn't. No, there were some technical glitches
It's a
that we couldn't.
genius move, by the way. As a parent, I'm just saying. A genius move.
Well, I think maybe that's what sparked his interest in that he ended up going to film
Fablemans.
school.
Steven Spielberg's The Fablemans.
I haven't seen it yet, so don't. But I know
the
what it's
Butler
about.
did it.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, I know.
you can, it's semi-autobiographical for sure. But then you look at George Tillman Jr., who said the same thing about his parents being supportive of having him fulfill what he really wanted to do. I think that's the greatest thing a parent can do.
It is. You really do. I have my youngest son, who is a tremendously gifted artist, is going
Like a painter or a sculptor?
Sculptor, paint. He works a lot on his iPad and just draws great creature design and stuff like that. So we want to support that. My oldest, my daughter, is in the tech field. I would love to support that, but I can just barely spell tech.
And I just want to say for the record, your beautiful wife,
Mm-hmm.
who I know from the store Magpie in Studio City, insisted you bring me this beautiful bottle of sake with these great sake glasses, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
They're beautiful. And so she's so classy and wonderful.
Well, thank you.
So thank you for doing that. But you made it known that your wife, this is not your idea, it's your wife's idea.
No. She's the class of the group. I wouldn't know what to do without her.
You mentioned about great editing is probably seamless. And I always learned that. I learned that in acting school. I learned that in the conservatory at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers, where they're saying if you see the work, it's not great. You don't want to see the seams. If you look at someone's suit and you go, that tie is extraordinary, it's better to say, you look amazing, right? And I think that's kind of what you're saying. I'm really trying to wrap my head around this notion of your feeling about how to judge great editing. I'm going to go back to this and see what you think. That the way people view great editing, again, is often a mistake of maybe some fancy editing techniques that might be misconstrued with really good editing. In other words, flash. But some of my favorite movies are movies that hold that camera, that you have the confidence to hold that shot for as long as you do. I think that's as equally as beautiful. You sort of said that, but I just wanted to get a little bit more on that because I think people are going to find that fascinating.
So to go back to the ensemble analogy, every so often, a tie that pops is worth commenting on. It's dynamic and that stands out. And in movies, there are moments that are not seamless by design. And if it's warranted, if the story or the character call for it, and if it's something that is creative from all points of view, then it's worthwhile. And we'll notice that. Alan Heim is another guy who is one of my mentors. I've worked with Alan. He's been the president of our guild, president of ACE. He's wonderful and a brilliant editor. One of the great movies I noticed the editing in a good way was All That Jazz. Now, it had a lot going for it. There were multiple time frames.
Was that Bob Fosse or was that
That was
him?
Bob Fosse.
No, I'm saying who's...
Well, we don't know. We don't know. But I will tell you that there's no question that the first time I don't remember the year of All That Jazz, but the first time editing was applauded in a theater, in a regular retail theater. This wasn't at a screening.
Right.
The first time I ever heard anybody applaud the editing, and I knew it was the editing, was when they did all the pirouettes in the very beginning of the movie.
Wow.
But it wasn't really crazy inventive.
Right.
It was clearly by design, but it was executed to perfection. It was one of those rare cases where you design something through the writing and through the production, and that sticks.
Was that scripted?
I'm sure it was scripted. It had to have been because it was
one mold went to the next, to the
right,
next, to the next.
And by the way, if it was written, it was written in one line, as an eighth of a page, and then it was shot with this design. And Alan did it, and obviously executed it perfectly. It wasn't groundbreaking, it wasn't anything remarkable, but it was great, and it was.
I remember it now just by thinking about it.
And he won an Oscar, deservedly so. The bigger work in that movie was when to choose to go to the fantasy sequences. There were so many great things about that movie that half of them probably were by design and half of them were found in the course of editing. And I mentioned that I kind of out of nowhere, I said I've done a lot of sports movies, and then we started talking about Rudy. But the reason I bring up sports movies is because you write a certain thing in sports movies and you have to board it when you're shooting it. You have to prepare to shoot it in a certain way.
Of course.
You have to write it in a certain way to get all this stuff. But I've done a half a dozen sports movies and none of them have gone the way that the script indicated because it's flat. It's boring. It's not.
All that that you have to do is you've got to get those 3 touchdowns, or you have to make sure that you lose that last to get to. But
sure, there are moments of it. There are moments of it, but inside of it,
right.
and it's always about the life on the sidelines and all the story stuff that comes into it. But the actual. And probably, I haven't done a musical, but the same thing might apply to musicals, although they might be a little more by design.
I was just going to ask you, is there something that you'd like to do?
Oh, God. Well, I've done plenty of musicals. We just don't make them anymore. Seldom do we see them.
Theaters, because there's been a slew of them that just hadn't worked theatrically. But, but they're still making them, I guess, for streaming services. Do you work for the streaming services a bunch?
No, I'm still just hanging on by my fingernails to movies that come out in the theaters, because what do you do for the testing process for a streamer?
We do often go into the theaters to do it, or we will, during COVID, Screen Engine ASI, my wonderful firm, invented a platform called VirtuWorks, and it's a virtual synchronous in real-time screening platform for 200 people, whatever, to watch a movie, and you get to watch people watching your movie at home.
Wow.
So you're actually toggling and pulling up groups of people, and it's pretty fascinating.
The old days of television testing where we had the little cranks.
We still have that, and
you turn the dials. And
I actually own that company. It's called ASI. It was the preview house up on Sunset. I bought that company almost a dozen years ago, and have evolved it since. We're in North Hollywood now, but the idea of it still exists, and we've added the dial to the online portion as well. So we have an online dial, like a slider dial, plus we have the analog dial, because there's thousands of pilots that use that technology. Ron Howard talks about a great story of going to the preview house and testing his first movie. I think it was Grand Theft Auto, and Roger Corman brought Ron there and piggybacked onto a Geritol commercial that was being tested right before it. So there were all these older females in particular, some males, but mostly females, way over the demo that this movie was intended for as its target. And they tested it. And Ron says, oh my God, I thought we were just screwed. And essentially the thing tested okay, even better than okay. But the quality of the response, what people were saying about the pace and so forth, was extremely helpful to him. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. Even with being outside of the demo, it was still some of those basic things So even in an online platform, you may not get the contagion of kind of the laughs or the scares in an overall sort of audience, but you can see them, but you get all of those other things, right? Do you care about the characters? Is the pace moving? In fact, the pace at home, the benchmark is higher. People will tune out sooner than they'll walk out of a movie theater. It's more of a commitment.
Yeah.
So there's ways to do it now. If you could say the most recent best edited movie that you've seen is, what would you say it was? Is there one that comes to mind?
No, I don't think of movies as being well edited.
I love that. I mean, can I tell you something? That's one of the strongest things I've walked away with this interview with, is that I think that is really important to understand, that it really goes hand in glove with the directing and the writing.
Yeah, and it's unique to films. There's no editing in any other. I mean, there's book editing.
I often say the length of the movie is generally the director's problem, if you will, meaning they could have directed it faster within scenes because there's only so much you can cut to, but the pace is often the editor. So if we look about pace and length.
Well, pace is an interesting word.
Do you know what I mean, right?
It's to editors, that's a 4-letter word. It's the word that we really don't want to even talk about. It's not that we don't understand that pace is important, but when the lay person talks about pace, it's not just how fast something is moving.
Or slowly.
Or how slowly it's moving.
What is
it's
it
not
then?
about speed. It's about engagement. And it's about confusion. Confusion is the enemy of pace. And it's always
So
been
funny
that
you say
way.
that. So here's the thing. Fast pace is usually a proxy for confusions. And slow pace is often a proxy for boredom, lack of engagement. Lack of engagement. It's exactly right.
Yep.
And I often will tell a director when they say, well, can we not talk about pace? And I'm like, well, we sort of have to see where they're not engaged. Hey, why don't I go into it like that? Why don't I talk about where they weren't engaged in the movie, if at all? But we have certain benchmarks of norms that are pace question. And people sort of, out of all the studies we've run, they sort of understand that nomenclature. Is that the word?
Yeah, and we obviously pay attention to it.
And length. Length to me is a feeling thing. It's not a, length is like, it just felt like I was sitting here too long.
Yeah, if there's enough story to sustain the length, you'll know it. If there isn't, you'll also know that.
That's why you kind of know when you're dealing with a horror movie that is kind of by the numbers, that to know that you come into it and it's 2 hours and 10 minutes, you probably have an issue right off the bat.
You do, even if it's all good.
Or a
you
teen
could,
comedy that's
but you could
over
end
2
up,
hours.
You can end up with too much of a good thing. That exists. That's a real thing. I remember a long time ago, I saw Robin Williams stand up at the Universal Amphitheater in his heyday, and I had to leave. I had to leave because it was like we were hurting ourselves laughing. It wasn't going to get any funnier. It just couldn't get any funnier.
It was almost overwrought.
No. It was great. It was brilliant. It was amazing. The guy was the greatest. But at a point where you just like, I got to leave. This is too much.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. It might be the dumbest thing I've ever said. It might have been the dumbest thing I ever did because I might have missed some great jokes. But it was too long.
You got your meal.
I got the meal. It was too much. I was stuffed. And sometimes, that I don't think I've been in a movie situation where we had that, where it was just too long.
I work on so many of
I'll bet
movies.
you do, but not because they're too long, but not because they're too much of a good thing. It's a rarity, but it can happen.
Well, let's say something different. So if you have a special effects movie, for example, and one thing is trying to top the next, but there's no down moments, and you're just constantly going up and up and up and up and up, there is a time when you're just like, enough already. It's too much.
That's true.
It's too much. And know when to leave the party.
Yeah.
And also know when to break,
Gear
stop,
down.
exactly, so that you can get back up again.
That's right. That's very important. It's very important in writing. It's very important in structuring the movie. And we come upon that all the time because, and I'll tell you, if I have a pet peeve about the preview process, it's something that has only come around in the last 10 years or so. What am I waiting for in the preview process? I'm waiting for that question, how is the pace? That's the thing I remember. And it's always was, is it too fast? Is it too slow?
Just right.
Or is it just right? And then sometime along the last...
by the way, I always ask it, is it just right? Is it too fast? Or is it too slow? Because I don't want...
But you want to lead the witness.
I don't want to lead the witness.
I get it. But in the last 10 years or so, there's a new one that crept in. It was
slow in places or parts?
It's just right, but slow in places.
Or parts.
Or parts, slow in parts. It's just right. Is it too slow? Is it too fast? Or is it just right, but slow in spots? And I thought,
well,
it's going to be slow in spots by design.
Let me talk about how that should be handled.
Okay.
So there's something called implicit response, where you're looking at the way in which hands go up. And if I say, was it too fast? People kind of put their hand up, and I'm doing my hand sort of half-assed here. So I see it's not like big hands. Then I say, did anything move too slowly? And I see 4 hands go up, and they're kind of not so, maybe it's not the right question. Let's go back to how many say the movie moved too fast in places or parts? 7 hands, big hands go up. Where? A confusion. Usually it's a confusion, just to your point before. Then I'll say, how many feel the movie moves too slow in places or parts? And 12 hands go up, big hands. Where? And now you can get more surgical about where it lost your attention. And that's how it should be handled, not with it's too slow, but good in many. It's not.
Well, okay. We can drill down on this a little bit because it's a huge part of what I do.
I'm there to do one thing, and that is to get you, David, enough actionable data to walk out and go into that editing room and try to have something that you can really sink your teeth into that may be holding people back. I have no other agenda at all. There's nothing else. So if I'm not getting what you want, you always need to tell me, maybe you can do that. Maybe you can particularly ask about the area of the movie of blah, 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 because you know the movie better than anyone else. Mm-hmm. That would be really helpful.
Well, sometimes, you do get a list of questions from the filmmakers before you go into the focus group. And sometimes those are, agenda serving, because we oftentimes go into the preview process where people are hoping to hear certain things because they have their own.
I also know how to dismiss a lot of that stuff because I'm not going to be the political pawn there, as you know.
That's right.
And so, anyway, God damn, we can talk forever.
Let's do that.
I am so glad you were here. David Rosenbloom, you're an amazing man, amazing editor, so gifted, and thank you for sharing some of your wisdom with us today. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Kevin. It was a blast.
And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's interview. Check out David's upcoming movie, The Plane, starring Gerard Butler. Also, I encourage you to look up some of his past work on your streaming platforms. For other stories like this one, please check out my book, Audienceology, at Amazon or through my website at kevingets360.com. You can also follow me on my social media at KevinGets360. Next time on Don't Kill the Messenger, I will welcome producer, entrepreneur, and former president and CEO of CBS Films, the one and only Amy Baer. Until next time, I'm Kevin Getz, and to you, our listeners, I appreciate you being a part of the movie-making process. Your opinions matter.
Get a glimpse into a secret part of Hollywood that few are aware of and that filmmakers rarely talk about in the new book, Audienceology by Kevin Getz. Each chapter is filled with never-before-revealed inside stories and interviews from famous studio chiefs, directors, producers, and movie stars, bringing the art and science of audienceology into focus. Audienceology, how moviegoers shape the films we love. From Tiller Press at Simon & Schuster, available now.